So welcome back to another edition of the Impact Sessions with Nick Bramley. This week I'm delighted to have as a guest Charles Fawcett, who's the founder of a business called Twisted Automotive. He's got a fabulous story to tell and to share with us. We've entitled this week's podcast 20 Years as a Guardian of a Global British Icon and Brand. So that's an intriguing enough start. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Charles.
Thank you, Nick. Great to meet you. Thank you for having me on.
No problem at all. I've followed your story with interest. We've got a mutual connection in Richard Hall at PDM in Thirsk, and that's where you're based. And I've sort of followed the Twisted Automotive story with some interest. So I thought we'd explore it in a podcast, and I'm sure you got a story that our listeners and viewers would be fascinated by. So as I say, that the podcast entitled 20 Years as a Guardian of a British Icon and Brand. We're going to explore a transition from a boyhood passion into a £10 million turnover business. So do you want to tell people what that passion was and still is? What's that all based around then, Charles?
It's probably a very, very difficult question, actually. Twisted as a business came about, really it was, it kicked off in sort of 2000, but was probably a bit of a pipe dream and early stage planning in the late 90s. I was really fortunate when I grew up to be, my father was in the motor trade and he always dealt in weird and wonderful vehicles. So I grew up in vehicles. When it came to taking my driving test, I could think of nothing other than driving. When it turned midnight of my 17th birthday, I was in the car with my dad. The first vehicle was a Range Rover that I drove on the road, and I didn't know what a box junction was, but I could drive. I'd been driving since I was 7 or 8 years old. So it's all about vehicles. I grew up with boxy analog vehicles. They had chokes, they had glow plugs, they didn't have ABS, they didn't have complicated wiring systems. They were ever so simple. I drove probably hundreds of vehicles before I got to being 17. All manner. We had some a track up the side of a field, and whatever Dad came home in, I used to run up the side of the field in it to see what it would do. And it could be a Saab Turbo, it could be an old Metro, any number of different vehicles. And I grew up around these wonderfully simple vehicles which had character, which had attitude, which all acted differently. And the one vehicle that stood out through all of this was the Land Rover, whether it was a series, whether it was a Range Rover Classic. They were always around. We always had them. Part of the motor trade, you know, they wouldn't stay very long, but I had the opportunity to experience them, to see what they did and didn't do, and what broke and what didn't break, and what was good and what wasn't. And I guess that, and leaving school without any particular qualifications other than a few GCSEs, a bit of an attitude. I fell into working with my dad in the motor trade, and very soon realised I wanted to do something for myself. I worked with Dad for 10 years, and there came a point when we need, for all sorts of reasons. And at that stage, we ran an off-road driving centre. We did a little bit of motor trading, and Twisted was kind of in its early stages. It was a Land Rover parts business selling performance upgrades mainly. There was very little logic in it. It didn't make any sense. At that stage, Land Rover Defender particularly was a farm utility vehicle that was uncomfortable. It was noisy. It was agricultural. It was very basic in its form. And people would say, you know, why do you want to make one go faster? Why would you want to give it more power? What's the point, you know? And for whatever reason, that's sort of like a some sort of reverse psychology. In my head, it was red rag to a bull. It made me want to do it more because it was odd. It wasn't normal. It wasn't perceived as being a normal thing you would do with a particular vehicle. So we did it more. And I found that the more we stood out for doing things that weren't normal, the more interest people had, and we started to build this little business. So yes, father and I parted company. He continued with the off-road business and with the motor dealing, and I had this twisted business. That was in 2007, so not that long ago, 13, 14 years ago. And we started to mold this business into what we now have, which is a really interesting little dot in North Yorkshire. That's a shed, in essence, a shed full of blokes that like working on Land Rovers. You know, we're all hobbyists in a sense.
It's a little bit more than a dot on the landscape. It's a little bit more than a shed in North Yorkshire, I think. And we'll talk later about some of your plans and the fact that you, from this small dot in North Yorkshire, have built something of a global sort of footprint. You've got customers all over the place. I'm intrigued about the Defender, having once had the mispleasure of being driven from York to South Wales and back in a day by a farmer client of mine at the time who had a particular invention, and we had to go to a meeting in, I think it was Caldicot, just over the bridge. And he turned up at my house in York in a Land Rover Defender. He said, "Oh, we're off to South Wales and back in a day in a Land Rover Defender." And by the time I came back, I can only describe the agony of the backache and the earache from the noise. That they weren't at that stage designed, I don't think, for that kind of capability. So it's intriguing that you thought, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll because it started off. It's not just engine stuff now. It's all sorts of developments around sort of the look and the feel and the style of them. But originally it was performance. Then was it?
So when we began, the Land Rover was a sluggish, uncomfortable vehicle, and they didn't turn very well. They didn't stop very well, but they had this wonderful character about them. And actually, a good driver in a Defender, somebody who understood it and could communicate with it, understanding its flaws, you could really pedal them along, and it was quite an achievement to pitch one into a roundabout and come out the other side and point in the right direction. And you could make them do things that they ought not to do. And so when we started to apply more power and tweak the suspension and change the brakes and alter the seating and all the other things that we did, you could really make them a fun vehicle to drive. As you know, Defender, Land Rover across the board, but Defender has a huge following worldwide. And we've established a name and a brand that it's synonymous with building the best Defender. And that's what we continue to do right now. It's all about making the Defender the best it can be. And, I suppose my early years experience of all sorts of different vehicles, I'm not trained in anything, but I've kind of tried lots of things with different vehicles. And, talking about your trip to South Wales, I remember when I was probably 13, as a family, we went down to Brightwell's auction in Leominster in Herefordshire, which was the biggest 4x4 auction at the time. And I think we took 3 vehicles: a Isuzu Trooper, a Discovery One, and a Toyota Hilux single cab pickup. My mother drove one, my father towed one behind the other, and we got to this auction. We sold everything but the Toyota pickup. There was me, my sister, and my middle sister, and my mum and dad. And we had to get home. And he couldn't buy anything with more than 2 seats, so we had to come back in this Toyota pickup. So my sister and I travelled all the way back from Leominster in Herefordshire in the back of the pickup, up the M5, up the M42.
In the flatbed bit.
You just in the open pickup, yeah. Luckily, it was summertime, and we didn't have a jacket with us. We sat in back, waving at all the truckers. We could do things like that back then. But I suppose what I'm saying is these vehicles have surrounded me, and I've been so fortunate to be in among them. And ultimately you draw a couple of boxes and a couple of circles. You've got what is in essence a 90s and 80s and 90s 4-wheel drive and a Defender.
Yeah.
They're so simple, they're wonderful to work with, and in reality what we have here is a business that allows for the people who desire Defender to in fact have that, but it be just that little bit better, and it just do things a little bit more orderly.
Talk to me then, Charles. Who are the people? typically who would buy a Defender because it's iconic, the shape and the style and the ruggedness and the indestructibility and the go anywhere kind of nature of it, who would buy a Defender and then say, I want it to make it the best it can be, like upgrading brakes and upgrading suspension, upgrading, you know, the whole lot. Who would typically do that as a type of customer potentially?
There isn't a typical. I think it's fair to say that our customers are all Defender enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm.
They could shop around and find components to apply to a vehicle, whether they fit it or somebody else does.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't really a rounded offering anywhere else. We're the only company that offer a rounded, thought through, well-engineered offering. And we make it relatively easy. We know what makes a Twisted. We know where the flaws are in Defender. We know what makes a Twisted. And a customer can come and know that what they're getting is going to do what they want it to do. And then they can add some levels of personality to it that suits their use.
Mm.
In reality, one of our customers might take that vehicle, I don't want to stereotype, but they might take it shooting and they might park that vehicle next to the Gamekeeper's Defender.
Mm.
They are both just Land Rover Defender. It doesn't insult anybody. Nobody gets upset by it. Nobody, has an opinion particularly, except for those that love it.
Right.
And it doesn't matter whether the Gamekeeper's one's 15 grand and the customer's one's 250 grand. They are still just Defender and they're accepted. And you're not going to be put in a box, stereotyped, where I do believe there are other vehicles out there that people take shooting that are highly inappropriate.
Mm.
And they have, you draw a certain audience. When you drive a Defender, when you drive a Twisted, you go to the fuel station and either people totally ignore you or they want to chat to you about the vehicle because they think it's wonderful. There's this lovely, friendly atmosphere around Defender. So our customers are very subtle. They want the best they can have, but they don't want necessarily anyone to know that.
Right. So everybody there probably know A, what they've spent on it, and B, what they've actually spent having done to the vehicle, because it's not as obvious, it's not as in your face as perhaps some facelifts that you see that you mentioned there might be inappropriate on another vehicle. It's all the subtlety of what's under the bonnet, what's under the suspension. There may be some elements of design on the bodywork, but it's still essentially a Defender at heart and at play, really.
It's still, we will never do anything to a Defender that prevents it from doing what it was intended to do in its first role as a basic agricultural workhorse.
Wow.
So, we developed our suspension system. We didn't lower it, we didn't lift it, we didn't look to stiffen it. We made it compliant. We softened the first movement of the spring. We lightened the front anti-roll bar. We stiffened the rear. We gave it manners. We made it communicative. We got rid of the inherent understeer issues, but it sits at the standard height. It's got as much travel as standard, so it's just as good off-road. But the way that it drives is worlds apart from the standard vehicle.
Okay.
It's phenomenal. So everything we do, it's got to still do its original job. We're not trying to make it into something it's not. And that sort of leads me to say, so many times customers or inquirers have come to see us or contact us and said, look, I'm looking at buying a new KN or a new Range Rover or a new Mercedes, and I thought I'd consider your vehicle while looking at that because they're a similar price point. What do you think I should do? And I say, well, buy the Porsche, buy the Cayenne, or buy the Merc or the Range Rover, because you must never put a Defender in that sphere. If you try to, it will either not suit you or you'll end up replacing it. The people that buy our vehicle buy it because they love it. They don't need it. There's no purpose for it. Quite often they create a purpose. Oh, I bought a dog, so I better get a Twisted, or got a little trailer, or got a chalet, or whatever. There's always a reason, but the reason isn't ever particularly legitimate, just because of how it makes them feel.
So
and I have to say,
The question I've got for you, Charles, on that then is you mentioned there about it's obviously the iconic brand of Land Rover, it's Defender. It's not just the Defender range, or is it, that's where you focus on, or anything Land Rover, Range Rover related?
No, Defender.
Just Defender.
Defender. Yeah. Yeah.
Given that specialism and given that expertise in everything Defender related, has that been the difference between Twisted being able to grow as a specialist rather than being a generalist kind of modifier, as it were, which anybody and everybody, there's 2 or 3 in each town, isn't there?
Ultimately, the specialist will attract a customer who expects a certain level of service, as would a generalist business that offers lots of different mods to lots of different things. That there'll be a certain customer. I think our customer is it's a much longer relationship. They buy it because they want it and because of how it makes them feel, not because they want it quickly to show it off to somebody. Ours is very subtle. And I think it's very important to be focused. It's very important to stay true to your roots. And I've always said I'll never do anything other than Defender, but I have to admit I'm starting to question whether the brand is now strong enough and big enough to actually put another product into the sphere. And that might be something that's in the offing for next year, but it'll still be very true to the roots and very, very we will honor the next, but Defender will continue. I think we've got Defender in a place now where we are the go-to, and we can possibly now add something to the stable, as it were.
But you've spent 13 years doing that. When did you become the go-to, do you reckon, Charles? When did it become known that you were the go-to place? If you got a Defender you want to do some work to, get yourself to Thirsk and see the team at Twisted?
I think we have, particularly since the end of production, we were very fortunate to be positioned to take big stock of Defender when they ceased production, which put us in a fortunate position where we had stock that potentially nobody else had. That clearly helped. But I think probably 5 years before that, I noticed that people stopped asking us, how does your X compare with somebody else's X? How does your suspension compare, your intercooler compare, your wheels compare? They stopped asking those questions. And in fact, they almost stopped saying, what makes a Twisted? Why is it priced there when I can get something there? They began to understand that actually a Twisted is a product in its own right. But they don't come to us to buy a Twisted necessarily. They come to buy the best Defender they can buy. Yeah. And we were keen to keep that sort of almost a separation. We are Defender, but and we are Twisted, but we're not saying that you're buying a Twisted. You are buying a Defender. We're not trying to make it something it's not.
Yeah.
And I guess when we took on that battle with JLR, unfortunately with the trademark, and we had a couple of fairly significant battles with them over the order that we placed for the stock at the time, and we stood our ground. And I think with each of those instances, if we'd backed down, I think we would have probably done ourselves a disservice.
For those who don't know, explain a little bit about the within reason, the sort of the court battle of you being almost like cease and desist because a big corporate wasn't keen on what you were doing, etc. What how did that transpire? What happened there?
There were a number of times when we banged heads with the manufacturer. There were a couple of IP issues at early days which put us on their radar. Something and absolutely nothing at the time, but what that led to was when we eventually set up our other business, which is LR Motors. LR Motors focuses in selling used Defender vehicles rather than modified Defender vehicles. And we applied for a trademark for LR Motors, and JLR were very quick to inform us that we were encroaching on their space, as it were. So we did the honourable thing, and we removed our application and entered into some sort of negotiations with them, only to find out that under the radar, one of their agents had slipped a trademark application in for the letters LR, because in fact, not only had they never used them, they had never registered them. Wow. So it was a little underhand that they had one trademark agent beating us up over infringement with their of their intellectual property, and then they had another agent over here potentially registering a trademark they'd never used or didn't own. So I kind of dug my heels in with that, and I then opposed their application because it transpired we'd used it first, and we had this fairly long battle with them, which it was nerve-wracking when we went to the IP court in Wales, but it was particularly nerve-wracking when we ended up in the High Court and then the Court of Appeal over the same subject. But we eventually, it was ruled when we finally got to the Court of Appeal that well, at each stage we won our side and the little fight, but when it got to Court of Appeal, it was squashed, and they weren't allowed to appeal further. They did go on to apply for a community mark in Europe, but as Brexit happens in January, that will fall away, which will allow us to continue down the path of registering the trademark in the UK. We weren't looking for anything that we couldn't have. I think it was a legitimate claim and a legitimate fight. The reality is, LR is it's an acronym, I guess. It's slang, and to an enthusiast of the Land Rover brand, which actually, when you think about it, that's a minute proportion of the population. So to the Land Rover enthusiasts, LR means something, but to the wider audience, the wider world, LR is just two letters, and even when you Google it, it doesn't bring up Land Rover. So it was unfair of them to try and stake a claim to that as being their letters. Okay. Without having done that. So that was one of them anyway. It was an interesting battle, and it certainly had me on edge for quite a time.
I can imagine. Did it not make you fall out of love with the brand at all, in terms of the fact that you were LR, you were Defender, you were Twisted, and yet the big boys who owned the branding of that were really trying to do all they could to stop you being successful. Did you not lose a bit of love for the Defender and the LR at that time?
I wouldn't fall out of love with the brand. I might fall out of love with the corporation or the people involved, but the brand has I've had a great life working with Defender. I've been all over working with Defender. I flew into Sri Lanka a few years ago, before 9/11, and carried out some tuning work on a load of Defender out in Sri Lanka. And on the way back, I'd fallen asleep in my chair. It was, I don't know what time, middle of the night. And one of the stewards came over, woke me up, said, "Mr. Fawcett, the captain would like to see you." And it transpires I'd remapped the captain's Defender the day before, so I got to sit with him in the cockpit right the way over Northern Europe. I've got some incredible customers, and I've been invited to do some amazing things with these people. It's all from that passion for Defender. So I feel really fortunate that I've been able to be in this place and meet all these amazing people, and do some really cool things.
Where then, Charles? Where would you say has been the most interesting place that the Defender and the Twisted journey's taken you to? Then, where would you say unexpected, maybe, or that kind of thing?
Well, Sri Lanka was incredible. To meet such a huge following for Defender over there, incredible. I think it's more about the people you meet necessarily than the places you go, and there's a level of conversation which allows you to speak to anybody, and that level is Defender level. We're all passionate about it. We run an event every year called the Yorkshire 300, and we were a little cautious when we first decided to do this. It came out from wanting to drive the North Coast 500, but it was such a logistical nightmare to try and get customers up there with accommodation and so on and so forth. We created our own 4-day event, Yorkshire 300, and we go to all the places in Yorkshire that I sort of hold dear. You know, Sutton Bank. We look at the view off Sutton Bank. We go to the White Horse. We trek up through the Yorkshire Dales and so on. And the first event we ran, we had, you know, farmers. We had big money people with big businesses. We had such a wide spectrum of individual on this event. I was a little nervous about sitting at dinner with everybody each night and having lunch with everybody. I'm not a big talker at the best of times, and sitting with people you don't know, I find that quite challenging. This event flowed from the moment everybody met, and it didn't matter who they were, what the background was, what they did or didn't have. It was totally irrelevant. They talked on a level which, I remember one couple sent everybody afterwards a jar of honey from their bees, and then another couple sent, it was just, true friends were made, and you wouldn't put a lot of these people together. But it was the Defender talk. It was the fact that we were so passionate about the same thing.
I was just going to say the common theme's the Defender there, isn't it, really? It does seem, to transcend sort of age. I was going to say gender. It's got a pretty masculine feel about it, but I'm assuming you got quite a few lady Defender fans and owners, but it seems to be quite a masculine brand, really, in that respect. But I want to ask you about something which I'm fascinated by, really, and it's about innovation. To run a business out of as you said, a small shed on a dot on a map in Thirsk, which is not true, and actually develop this entire business from this clear passion just for the Defender. Innovation must be in there somewhere to keep going and keep developing and keep sort of what's next, etc. Where does innovation sit within the Twisted family?
I think innovation is key. Being told you can't do something is what tends to get me going, and surrounding yourself with people who can do what you can't do. So the business has got to here, I believe, because I have ideas and I've got people around me who know how to make those ideas turn into something. So, the suspension story was a prime example. I wanted an incredible suspension system, not a clue how to create it. I know how it works.
You knew you wanted it. You knew you wanted it. Didn't know.
I know where I want to get to with it, and I know how everything works and what it all does. I know the basics of the whole thing, and I thoroughly understand the vehicle. What I now need to do at this stage, 10 years ago, is find the person who talks my language but actually understands the technical side. And then to relay that to manufacturers to make it happen. And I found this wonderful guy called Roddy Harvey-Bailey, who's at the time he was probably in his 70s, I would think. I don't want to insult him, but proper gentleman out of motorsports, but a Defender fan. And we just ended up driving around Leicester countryside talking about what we were trying to achieve from this vehicle. And every so often he'd say, maybe not 40 pounds out of that back. Oh gosh, we need to add 20 there. And it's just talking and driving flat out. Anyway, we got back to the base and he just started scribbling numbers on it, in principle, on a fag packet. Handed these over to a suspension engineer who turned them into a product. And it's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Never needed to change it to this day. It does everything I wanted it to do. So it's about relationships. It's about finding the right people who can do what you need them to do. They win out of it. We win out of it. Our customer wins out of it. You can't shortchange people. You can't not pay people. You can't overpromise, underachieve. You've got to do all the things you say you're going to do, and that becomes a wonderful kind of snowball that rolls down a hill and just gets bigger and better.
Can I ask
Yeah.
you a question? Can I ask you a question about the sort of customer experience then? So
Yeah.
I might have a Defender, a basic, model Defender, and I've decided for whatever reason I want a twisted version of that. Or I might come to you and say, can you do me a twisted Defender? Can you source that and whatever? Is it budget no limit? Is it, can I have a basic plus, a basic plus, an absolute everything and anything type thing? What's the scale of development I could do on my basic Defender if I had one? Does it start as a little bit of tweaking, or is it like all or nothing?
I think it's probably opportune at this stage to talk a little bit more about what we plan to do over the coming few years.
Mm-hmm.
We, as a business, we started out as a mail order parts business selling Land Rover upgrades. Mm. The more of that we did, the more people would say, oh, while you're sending me that, can you send me something that does this or something that does that? And we gradually evolved into then they'd say, can you fit it for me? And actually, can you supply the vehicle as well? And it just evolved. And we got to a point, and I think the point was probably 4 years ago, where I'm trying to do what you've just described. That comes along, wants to make some changes to his Land Rover, and we deal with him. We have some foreigner wanting a huge everything built that takes thousands of hours, and they want it yesterday, and everything in between, and mail order parts, and building a brand. And I think it's fair to say, over the last 4 years, at some point, the theory that we build the Defender and make it the best it can be didn't get forgotten, but it got diluted because we have tried to say yes to everybody. So I've ended up with a very, very busy business. We were trying to build a new business in the States, Middle East. We wanted to get into EV and so on.
What's EV?
Electric Defender. And we were trying to do all these things, and fundamentally we're a very small team of people, and I guess my ideas and the ability to actually see them all through became somewhat muddled with the daily business. And I think we've as a result of that, we've made a firm decision that in fact over the next period we're actually going to have to start saying no to people. So as of January, we've got quite a long order book, which we're working through, and everyone will get what they've asked for. But as those advance orders deplete, we're actually going to only allow 2 customers a year to have a vehicle built here.
Wow.
We're closing our web shop, which sounds really negative, but so many brilliant people have invested in buying a vehicle from us that's been built to be the best it can be, and then we're selling products that have got our name on, that are the sort of the aesthetics of that customer's vehicle, almost allowing people to replicate that.
Right.
And in trying to be everything to everyone, we're actually losing sight of customer care. So we're going to stop promoting ourselves to the wider world. We're going to start writing letters to our customers by hand, and running events and inviting them to join us on this journey like the Yorkshire 300. And we're going to start saying no, because we can't be everything to everyone. We've got to a point now where Defender, in its most basic form before we touch it, is actually a very expensive vehicle. The odd unused new vehicle that you see now on the market, so somebody might have bought it in 2015 or 16, stuck it in the barn, they bring it out now and they advertise it for sale, they're 75 grand and more. And that's untouched. They were 25 grand in 2015.
Yeah.
So the start point now is elevated to a point where actually we shouldn't be trying to do more. What we need to do is be better at what we do.
I think your expectations of your customers at that price point are going to be elevated as well, aren't they? So you're going to have to do less customers and more elevated customer experience, I guess.
most of the work in our workshop at the minute is vehicles that are 150, 200 plus. We will also take a vehicle in for a service, or we will fix a vehicle for somebody, and everything in between. But the reality is we can't do either of those things properly because we're doing the other. And so what we plan to do over the next year, we're going to build 24 twisted vehicles.
Right.
We're going to create 6 born vehicles, which is quite an exciting new project. And we're going to do 2 customer builds, and that's it. And what that will mean is our brand will grow because we're saying no.
Yeah.
And it will become more aspirational. It'll become more exciting. But most of all, we can stick to our plan and build the best Defender.
Excellent.
And nothing else. So that's our plan for the next 12, which I'm quite excited about.
Really interesting way of looking at it. It's almost like stripping it back, going back to basics and restarting again.
Yeah.
13 years of knowledge, isn't it, really? So the last question I've got is, what does the future hold beyond that? Have you got some aspirations to get into other, you sort of touched on, I don't know if you want to share or not, it's still trade secrets, but you talked about maybe getting into other things and not just the Defender. Is it too early to ask you that, Charles, at this stage?
So we've allocated time next year in the workshop to develop a new vehicle. And that will be announced sometime probably the middle of the year, from a similar stable, something really lovely, another very iconic vehicle from the UK. We've bought a marine engineering business down in Salcombe, and we're launching Twisted Marine. So we're going to be importing some US 80s and 90s US muscle boats.
Wow.
That we're then going to twist. So white suit and Ferrari Testarossa.
Just stop you there, Charles. I guess you couldn't do that. For those who don't know the geography, you couldn't really do that from Thirsk, could you? Because you're not really, you're a little bit sort of landlocked in Thirsk.
We're rather landlocked, yes.
You're moving down to the south coast.
Well, it came out in a conversation in the middle of last year that because we've one of the big things we've done this year was, in fact, we sold the license for Twisted North America and Twisted Middle East and Twisted electric vehicle. Again, it was part of the theory that we can't be everything to everyone. We were trying to be in all these different markets, but actually there are specialists, there are brilliant people over there. So we've licensed the brand to the different markets. That's once again allowed us to focus more on the UK. And following a very brief conversation with Jonathan, the group FD here, I said, do you know what? I said, turning dollars into pounds via a bank system is pretty boring, isn't it? Should we buy some boats and bring them back and do something with them? And off he went, and a couple of days later came back, dropped some details on my desk. He said, I think we should buy this marine engineering business as the base from which to carry out the boat modification. So it's very hard to get access to water via a slip in the UK commercially. So it seemed sensible to buy a little business that already had that.
Yeah.
And Salcombe is such a wonderful place with a great brand itself. So we've got Thirsk. We've actually this year as well, we've bought an old cinema in Thirsk, which we're turning into a venue and showroom. So we've got Thirsk, we've got Silverstone, a little base there for showroom, and we've got Salcombe. Wow. I think we've got the Dales, we've got the racetrack, and we've got the sea. And I think that's a lovely twisted experience, really.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end as well, the geography lesson of the UK. And I think that's been really interesting to see how there's clearly DNA, there's clearly a passion, there's clearly, cut you in half, Charles, it would probably say, Defender somewhere like Blackpool Rock cut right through you, wouldn't it? Which is great to see. And I think those two things are not disconnected from the success you've had and the focus you've had. But I also have been really interested in the fact that, you can get busy, but then you lose a bit of focus on that. And what you're planning to do and strip it back and start again is a really, really interesting way. Some of our audience might really resonate with that.
Big isn't always best. I think we want to be brilliant, not big. For
those who just heard the gap there, I was just a little cough. And You've always got to say these days, haven't you, with a little cough, that it's not connected to anything sinister, I don't think. So that's good. So listen, Charles, I'm going to share your screen details with, let people know about a bit more about the podcast. Basically, the podcast, as those who know, is available every Tuesday. A new episode comes out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube channel, Google Play, Podbean and Castbox, amongst others. You can check it out on the Impactus Group website as well. I've put Charles's contact details on there. We've dealt with Charles through his PR company, Faith PR, so their contact details are there for getting in touch. That's been an absolutely fascinating and really, really interesting session, and I really appreciate you giving up your time this morning for the recording of this, Charles. I wish you absolute success with Twisted Marine, and also with the mysterious new vehicle that I'm sure the audience are now trying to guess, an iconic British brand vehicle, but we'll wait to see the press releases on that when that comes through next year. So thank you for your time, Charles. Thanks again for being a guest on the Impactus Sessions podcast, and appreciate seeing you.
Thanks, Nick. All the very best.
Cheers. Thank you.